Number 8. Christopher O Crowley. 24-year-old Caroline Nozel met Christopher O Crowley while working at a supermarket in Madison, Wisconsin in 2015. Described by others as friendly but creepy, O Crowley had recently gone through a breakup, had a child he didn't see, and had also recently been homeless. Caroline offered to be there for him as a friend, despite her co-workers' concerns that her kindness would backfire. A few weeks later, Caroline drank too much during an outing with her work pals. O'Crowley offered to take her home, but he wasn't sure where she lived, so he took her to his place instead. The next morning, Caroline couldn't shake the notion that O'Crowley had come onto her in her intoxicated state. She realized that he was likely misinterpreting her sympathy for him as a romantic interest and began distancing herself from him. Caroline stopped answering O'Crowley's text messages and avoided him at work, but the more she pulled away, the more obsessive O'Crowley became. She eventually put her foot down and told him to stop smothering her, but the unwelcome behavior continued. O'Crowley was fired in early 2016 amid rumors of an inappropriate relationship with a younger co-worker, and on top of already being angry that Caroline had stopped talking to him, he blamed her for the loss of his job. Determined to get revenge, O'Crowley waited for Caroline to leave work one evening and fired 3 bullets into her chest, killing her in the parking lot. But in the end, he was convicted of her murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, he died less than a year into his sentence in 2017. Number 7. Louise Sako. 23-year-old Celeste Mano was sleeping in her bedroom at her home in Melbourne, Australia in 2020 when an intruder smashed through her window and stabbed her to death during the early morning hours. Shortly thereafter, the young woman's former co-worker, 35-year-old Louise Sako, drove to the police station and turned himself in. He was then charged with murder. Mano was Sako's team leader at a call center until he left the job about a year earlier. When he quit, Mano offered her emotional support, but Sako overstepped, and by the time he killed Celeste, she'd reported him to law enforcement at least twice for stalking. Sako pleaded not guilty to Mano's murder, claiming that his poor mental health absolved him of culpability for the crime. In early 2023, a forensic psychiatrist deemed him unfit to stand trial and predicted that he'd remain incapable for at least the next year. At the last update, it was unclear whether the court plans to challenge the findings, which would put a jury in charge of deciding whether Sako is culpable for his actions. If the court agrees with the assessment, he'll be sent to an institution until his mental health is restored, and only then will he be released back into society. In the meantime, Mano's mother is campaigning for improved legal protection for stalking victims, and so far her efforts have led to the Victorian government's first ever review of Australia's stalking laws. Number 6. Ramin Cod Karam. During the pre-dawn hours one morning in March 2023, police responded to a reported shooting at a home in Redmond, Washington, where they found 35-year-old Mohammed Milad Nasseri lying in the front yard with a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. Inside, the cops found 2 more people who'd been shot dead, including Nasseri's wife, 33-year-old Zoreh Sadeghi. The third body was identified as 38-year-old Ramin Cod Karam, a long-haul truck driver who'd allegedly become obsessed with Zoreh Sadeghi in 2021 after meeting her in a chat room for Farsi-speaking people seeking careers in the technology field. Ramin soon began to barrage Sadeghi with harassing and threatening phone calls, and he showed up uninvited to her house on at least one occasion before returning to kill her and her husband. His behavior only escalated, despite Sadeghi's repeated attempts to cut ties. Sadeghi made multiple police reports against her stalker, who at one point had contacted her more than 100 times in a single day. The court finally granted Sadeghi an order of protection about a week before the shooting. Police had tried to serve Ramin with the order, but they couldn't find him, and it's doubtful that he would have obeyed the order anyway. Many people believe that stronger anti-stalking laws could prevent similar tragedies in America, where stalkers often roam free until their victims end up seriously injured or dead. Number 5. Ryan Shanawa. After suffering from lead poisoning as a child, 23-year-old Ashley Klein struggled with cognitive setbacks which put her mentality at a teenage level. But she was happy with her life in Robesonia, Pennsylvania, where she lived with her father and had a lot of friends. She was also in a relationship with a young man named Wesley Devonshire, and it seemed to be going well. Because Ashley's developmental delays made her more naive and trusting than the average adult, it was only natural for her loved ones to panic when she failed to show up for a New Year's Eve party in 2013 and was never heard from again. Ashley's family reported her missing the following morning, and authorities immediately began investigating. And naturally, they turned to her boyfriend first. Wesley Devonshire told detectives that he and Ashley were happy together. He claimed that he was at home on the night of Ashley's disappearance, but there was no way to confirm his alibi since he lived alone. Police put Devonshire on the back burner as a possible suspect and focused on other leads. They interviewed Ashley's longtime friend, Ryan Shanawa, who was the last known person to see her before she went missing. Shanawa said that Ashley had abruptly asked him to drive her home while they watched movies together that evening. He also claimed that Ashley had asked him to drop her off down the street from her house without explaining why. But with no solid evidence connecting Shanawa to Ashley's disappearance, police cut him loose and continued searching for clues. A break in the case finally came 2 weeks later when Ashley's charred remains were found by hikers in a remote wooded area 12 miles outside of town. She'd been assaulted, beaten, stabbed, set on fire, and left to die alone in the wilderness. While scouring gas station footage for video of anyone who may have bought the accelerant that was used to burn Ashley's body, detectives came across a young man named Adam Lynch. And lo and behold, Adam just so happened to be friends with Ryan Shanawa, the childhood friend who claimed he dropped Ashley off on the side of the road and never saw her again. Both men were implicated in the murder, but prosecutors pointed at Shanawa as the mastermind, arguing in court that the defendant may have had feelings for Ashley that weren't returned. The young woman's father also speculated along similar lines, theorizing that Shanawa became consumed by jealousy over Ashley's relationship with Devonshire. While Shanawa never revealed his motive for the crime, all signs point toward it being a classic case of an obsessed admirer deciding that if he couldn't have the person he wanted, nobody could. Thankfully, neither he nor Lynch will ever see freedom again. Both suspects were convicted of Ashley's murder and were sentenced to life plus an additional term of up to 40 years. Number 4. Sarah Williams. Ian Johnson of Helmshire, England, found himself struggling to choose between two women after he reconciled with his longtime partner, 60-year-old businesswoman Sadie Hartley, following some time apart. During their separation, Johnson had started sleeping with 35-year-old Sarah Williams. But he broke up with Williams due to her possessive and controlling behavior. Regardless, though, the two continued to exchange explicit text messages and photos, even after Johnson and Hartley got back together. Williams clung to her hope that she and Johnson would reconnect on a more serious level, but when she failed to accomplish her goal by harassing Hartley, she decided that the only way she'd get Johnson back was if she eliminated Hartley from the equation by lethal force. Over an 18-month period beginning in 2014, Williams and her friend Katrina Walsh carefully plotted Hartley's murder. They put enormous effort into their plan, even carrying out a practice run before moving forward with the real deal. On January 14, 2016, Williams entered Hartley's home and paralyzed her with a cattle prod that she'd purchased in Germany specifically for the occasion. She then stabbed her victim 41 times in a jealous rage. But Williams never got the fairy tale ending she'd hoped to achieve through her gruesome act. Both she and Walsh were convicted of murder and were each sentenced to respective prison terms of 30 and 25 years. Number 3. Stephen Morgan. 21-year-old Wesleyan University student Johanna Justin Ginich was gunned down in broad daylight in 2009 while working at a campus bookstore in Middletown, Connecticut, and unfortunately, she died from her injuries at a nearby hospital. The killer, 29-year-old Stephen Morgan, turned himself into the police later that evening and was charged with murder. Joanna and Stephen had only briefly crossed paths 2 years earlier while attending a class at New York University. During that time, Joanna received dozens of unwanted emails and phone calls from Stephen. She reported the harassment but declined to press charges after learning that Stephen had left New York City. While searching Stephen's belongings after Joanna's murder, police found what appeared to be a detailed plan to assault and murder the young woman. Evidence showed that Stephen had traveled to Connecticut from Colorado to carry out his diabolical plot. Stephen's mental health remained at the center of the case as his defense team fought for an insanity conviction, arguing that their client was suffering from untreated paranoid schizophrenia at the time of Joanna's murder. The jury ruled in favor of the defense and found Stephen not guilty, but he was sentenced to 60 years in a psychiatric setting due to the obvious danger he posed to society. As of 2020, Stephen remained in a maximum security mental hospital while periodically undergoing court hearings to determine whether he's well enough to transition to a less restrictive environment. According to NBC Connecticut, his treatment team described his progress as uneven, while a social worker testified that Stephen had recently become increasingly disorganized and paranoid. He also has a history of refusing to take medication and other behaviors that have kept him at his current location. Joanna's uncle, Sam Ginich, has vowed to attend every single hearing to speak on behalf of Joanna as well as her father, who passed away in 2019. During the 2020 hearing, Ginich vocally opposed any reduction in Stephen's security conditions, arguing that nobody should have to worry that he'll relapse or stop taking his medication and commit another horrific act of violence. In a lawsuit against the psychiatric hospital filed later that year, Stephen blamed the court's decision to keep him in a maximum security facility on an employee's leaked comment to the media about how patients are allegedly allowed to play violent video games. He wrote in a filing document that he felt distressed, emotionally hurt, stigmatized for his mental illness, and singled out. While the outcome of the civil suit is unclear, the public was less than sympathetic towards Stephen, considering the fact that he'll never serve a day in prison for his actions. Number 2. Joe Atkinson. 24-year-old Poppy Devi Waterhouse was a talented mathematician who lived in Leeds, England with her 25-year-old boyfriend, Joe Atkinson. In 2018, she decided she wanted to move on romantically, but she and Atkinson continued living together while they each figured out their next steps. They both began seeing other people, but Atkinson struggled to accept the breakup, and as the reality sank in that the relationship was truly over, he inched closer to his boiling point. After a night out during the holiday season, he returned home and stabbed Poppy 70 times in an unprovoked, jealous rage. Before calling the police, Atkinson tried to clean up the crime scene and threw his bloody clothes away. He later argued in court that he killed Poppy in self-defense, but his story didn't hold up in the opinion of the jury and the judge. Atkinson was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 16 years. And since then, Poppy's loved ones have campaigned to strengthen Britain's criminal sentencing laws, which automatically dictate a lesser sentence if the crime occurs inside the suspect's home. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Daniel William. 20-year-old Samantha Shelley Nance began dating fellow college student Nathan Shuck while attending the Art Institute of Dallas in 2009. The relationship was abruptly cut short just 2 months later when Nancy's roommate found her murdered in her bed. She'd been stabbed 42 times, and there were no signs of forced entry, indicating that Shelley knew her killer and that the crime was extremely personal. Investigators initially suspected Nathan Shuck of killing his girlfriend, but they were unable to establish a realistic motive, and he also had an alibi. A clearer picture began to emerge when witnesses told detectives about recent growing tensions between Shelley and Nathan's roommate, Daniel William. Further investigation revealed that William was romantically attracted to Nathan, and he'd become increasingly jealous of Shelley as Nathan spent more time with her, and he wasn't exactly subtle about his growing hatred toward Shelley either. The day before Shelley's death, William had repeatedly messaged her asking where she was. He was also seen on surveillance footage buying hair dye, soap and gloves at a local Walmart. William admitted to being at Shelley's apartment on the day of her murder, but he claimed that he was only there to visit someone else. In the meantime, his history of anger issues surfaced. Police learned that while serving in the Navy, William had asked to be removed from his ship because he feared losing his temper and attacking his superiors. He maintained his innocence in Shelley's murder but was convicted of the crime in 2011, and now he's currently serving a life sentence behind bars.
10. Rachel Napier. 29-year-old Rachel Napier was expecting a typical girls' night when she went to a Botox party at her friend's house in Leicester, England. After injecting some Botox into Rachel's forehead, the attending beautician noticed that the woman had a lump on her lip. It was from an injury she received as a teen, and it was a major source of insecurity for Rachel. So when the beautician suggested lip filler, she readily agreed. What she didn't realize is that the beautician was an unlicensed ex-con, and she accidentally injected the filler into an artery. Rachel woke up later that night and couldn't feel her lips. They had swollen so big that her top lip touched her nose. She went to the emergency room where she was told that the country's healthcare system didn't cover the treatment she needed. The disfigured young woman had to shell out money to see a private doctor who dissolved the filler. Within 3 days of visiting the doctor, Rachel's lips were thankfully back to normal. But the close call inspired her to call for strengthened laws to regulate dermal filler treatments in the UK. 9. Karissa Raja. Plastic surgery is a lucrative business. Because it's so expensive, many people shop around for the best deal possible. And there are plenty of unlicensed crooks out there who are willing to put people's lives on the line by performing DIY treatments for a quick buck. In late 2019, 26-year-old aspiring social media star Karissa Raja began a series of butt lift procedures at the Encino, California home of mother-daughter duo Libby Adame and Alicia Gomez. The pair allegedly pretended to be specialists and injected Rajpal's rear end with cosmetic substances that were mixed with dangerous chemicals. Karissa died after her third session, and police charged Adame and Gomez with first-degree murder. The tragedy sparked an ongoing investigation, and authorities believe there may be more victims out there, including several who were disfigured and possibly one who died. Sadly, there are an alarming number of cases of people dying from illegal butt injections. Earlier this year, 49-year-old Natika Deontay Lee of Dallas, Texas, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter for her role in a young woman's death. Back in 2015, Lee injected liquid silicone into a nightclub dancer's derriere. The substance seeped into the victim's blood, and she died 4 days later. These needless tragedies are reminders of how important it is to do your research and make sure you're going to someone who's qualified to enhance your assets. 8. Kol Terin. Many people think of plastic surgery as something for women, but men get it too, and they are no more or less immune to its ill effects than anyone else. Kol Terin was a soldier in the Russian military. He wanted to bulk up his arms, so he injected his biceps and triceps with 3.2 quarts, 3 liters of petroleum jelly. His biceps grew to 24 inches, 61 centimeters around. The substance saturated the man's tissues and muscles and blocked his blood flow, causing hardened scar tissue to form. Terin, whose gargantuan limbs have earned him the nickname Popeye, must have realized that his arms were unnaturally huge, or at least that something wasn't right. He consulted a surgeon who told him that he faced either amputation or death if he didn't undergo surgery to remove the petroleum jelly. By then, he had a fever and was weak and in pain. He started the process in 2019 and is still receiving surgeries. In addition to going through medical hell, Terin has experienced a host of other misfortunes because of his poor decision. His girlfriend left him, and since injecting his arms with a dangerous substance didn't make him any stronger, his dream of being a successful MMA fighter isn't going very well. Surgeon Dmitry Milkonov told The Sun that it's becoming alarmingly common for people in Russia to inject petroleum jelly as an alternative to shelling out big bucks for approved cosmetic procedures. But petroleum jelly is meant for external use only and wreaks havoc on the body, especially the kidneys. 7. Terrible tummy tuck. The popular reality TV series Botched follows the stories of people who emerge from plastic surgery looking much worse than they went in. Doctors Terry Dubrow and Paul Nassif do their best to work miracles and undo the damage of less skilled surgeons. The show is in its 7th season. It recently featured a 49-year-old woman named Maritza, whose tummy tucks have destroyed both her body and her marriage. Maritza got her first tummy tuck in 2019, not very long ago, and it left her with what she calls a frankenbelly. While she was healing, her skin kept turning black. This was because the surgeon she saw had performed liposuction before doing the tummy tuck, which Dr. Dubrow says depletes the blood supply and stops the body from healing. Doctors kept having to cut Maritza's skin off, and she eventually needed a skin graft. It left her without a belly button. Creating a belly button is one of the most difficult things to do in plastic surgery, according to Dubrow. In order to even perform the procedure, he had Maritza sign a special consent form acknowledging that she understood the heightened risks that come along with it. Thankfully, the surgery went just fine. Maritza can stand to look at her midsection in the mirror again, and she feels like a new person. But it's not lost on her that things could have gone much worse. Would you ever get a tummy tuck, or have you? Let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 6. Nikki Belza. One day in 2016, a Las Vegas cocktail waitress named Nikki Belza woke up with tenderness in her left breast. At first, she thought she pulled a muscle, but she kept feeling worse and collapsed at her job. Nikki was rushed to the emergency room, where she later said doctors wrote off her concerns and sent her home with some painkillers. Things continued to worsen from there. Nikki developed a fever and soon learned she was in septic shock. Doctors told her that she had a 50% chance of dying if she didn't agree to have her left breast removed. Knowing the infection had spread to her blood and could soon infiltrate her other organs, she underwent the life-saving procedure. Nikki lived without a left breast for months while she recovered. But it's hard for a cocktail waitress to do their job in this condition, especially in Vegas, where appearance is everything. Once she got through her agonizing post-sepsis symptoms, including graying hair, shakiness, a weak immune system, and the inability to regulate her own body temperature, Nikki underwent several reconstructive surgeries to fix her lopsided chest. 5. Carol Bryan. When she was in her 30s, a Florida woman named Carol Bryan began getting Botox injections to minimize some fine lines on her face. At age 47, she visited a clinic she'd never been to before. The staff talked her into trying dermal fillers, which add volume to someone's face in areas that are thinning due to age. After the procedure, Carol's forehead swelled up every few days but shrunk back down to its normal size. Then a few months later, Carol's forehead swelled, and this time it didn't stop growing. She returned to the clinic where dissolving agents were injected to bring the swelling down. While there, Carol learned that silicone had somehow ended up in the syringe that was used for her filler injections. Silicone is never used for facial procedures. The clinic promised to fix the woman's face free of charge with regular appointments, and Carol obliged. But her face only became more disfigured. The dissolving agent was eating away at Carol's muscles and tissue. Her skin began to sag and her forehead filled with pus. She quit her job, became a shut-in, stopped letting friends and family come over to visit, and even thought about taking her own life. Carol lived as a recluse for years until her daughter, Sophia, couldn't take seeing her mom like this anymore and reached out to teaching hospitals in a desperate plea for help. Renowned plastic surgeon Bryan Boyd took her case, and he was eventually able to repair a lot of the damage. Carol's road to recovery has been long and painful, both physically and emotionally. She's now blind in one eye and may never look like she did before the botched procedure. But she's using her story to help others through her job as the director of Face-to-Face Healing, a nonprofit that raises awareness about disfigurements. 4. Louise Smith. When the world went into lockdown at the beginning of the ongoing global COVID-19 pandemic, people began joking about the weight they were gaining from their newfound sedentary lifestyle. Dubbed the Quarantine 15, these pesky few extra pounds were a mere inconvenience to most people. But the Quarantine 15 took a major toll on some people's self-esteem. One of those people was Louise Smith, a 37-year-old British hairdresser who had recently moved to Dubai for a fresh start after a breakup. Her friend said that she became obsessed with her image after gaining some weight during lockdown. She became so desperate to get her pre-pandemic figure back that she traveled to Iran for weight loss surgery. But something went horribly wrong during the procedure, and Louise died. The details were obscure, and her loved ones were left in the dark about the circumstances as they struggled to get Louise's body back to the UK. Iran is a popular place for low-cost plastic surgery, but this tragedy proves that these unbeatable deals can clearly come at a cost far greater than any amount of money. 3. Guana Weaver. Earlier this year, 38-year-old Guana Weaver and her friend Anastasia Smith traveled to Mexico for tummy tucks. The Long Beach, California native expected an in-and-out 4-hour procedure, but she died on the operating table. Smith barely survived and spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Weaver's grief-stricken family did some digging and found out that the person who performed Guana's tummy tuck is not a licensed plastic surgeon. They also learned that a third woman fell gravely ill at the same clinic on the same day. She was rushed to the emergency room with septic shock and now suffers from kidney failure. An autopsy found that Guana died from blood clotting issues and a heart attack. The clinic the women went to never pronounced Weaver dead or reported the tragedy to the U.S. Embassy. Then the business deleted its webpage. But Guana's mother is determined not to let crooked practitioners get away with their actions. Since her daughter's death, she has devoted her time and effort to raising awareness about the dangers of medical tourism, which is becoming increasingly popular among Americans seeking low-cost alternatives to plastic surgery in the U.S. The FBI is investigating the clinic, and it's hopefully only a matter of time before the business is forced to answer for its actions. 2. Venzo Zurlo. 36-year-old Venzo Zurlo first started going to Alcalera Jimenez de Rodriguez for Botox last year after meeting the Doral, Florida resident through a friend. A few months into his treatments, he asked Jimenez de Rodriguez about the possibility of getting a nose job. She agreed to do it for just $2,000, thousands less than the going rate for a rhinoplasty in the U.S. The self-proclaimed practitioner sent Zurlo home with prescriptions for painkillers under a doctor's name that he didn't recognize, which immediately raised flags. Over the following months, he realized that the surgery meant to make his nose look better had left him disfigured. Zurlo went to the police, who sent an undercover to Jimenez de Rodriguez for a plastic surgery consultation and decided there was enough evidence to criminally charge her. When officers went to the woman's office to arrest her, they found her in the middle of performing an illegal procedure on another victim. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the ordeal is that Jimenez de Rodriguez wasn't doing surgeries out of her home, which would have been an obvious red flag that she wasn't qualified. She was working at an established clinic posing as a doctor. The good news is that there's one less phony surgeon operating on people trying to improve their looks. But for Zurlo, the damage is done. Speaking with NBC Miami, he summarized the nightmare in one simple but heartbreaking statement. She ruined my life. 1. Anastasia Binaya. Botched plastic surgeries can physically harm or even kill people, and they also come with other consequences, especially for people whose income depends on their looks. This was the case for Anastasia Binaya, a Russian reality star from Belarus whose nose was left rotting from the inside after a rhinoplasty gone wrong. She opened up to her 159,000 Instagram followers about her suffering a few years after the procedure. By then, Anastasia's nose had deteriorated to the point where doctors said she had just weeks to save it before it decayed completely. The young woman had already spent lots of time and money trying to remedy the disfigurement to no avail, and she couldn't afford any more treatments. In a last-minute race against the clock, Anastasia pleaded with her fans for donations to help her get her nose fixed. Something similar happened to a famous Chinese singer and actress named Gail, who disappeared from the limelight without explanation last year. Little did her 5 million followers know she had gotten a nose job and it caused the tissue in the tip of her nose to die. Miss Gao eventually shared her story, revealing photos of her blackened nose and explaining that she was hospitalized for 2 months. The damage was so bad she would need more surgery, but she had to wait at least a year for some of the corrective work she had done to heal. In the meantime, Gao lost over $61,000 in wages because she couldn't work. The clinic that performed the operation had already been disciplined several times. Had Gao known about this, she might not have gone there. Her career-damaging debacle helped raise awareness about how widespread the problem of botched plastic surgery is, with many of Gao's fans demanding heightened accountability and stricter regulations in the industry.
Number 10. Wedding Crashers. A groom in California was brutally murdered when a couple of uninvited guests crashed his wedding reception. It was a classic case of wedding crashers, except this time, people died. 30-year-old Joe Melgoza was killed by blunt force trauma to his head at about 2 o'clock in the morning on the night of his wedding. What should have been one of the best nights of his life was actually the worst. According to what the family told NBC News, Los Angeles, 2 men that nobody knew showed up to the wedding reception, which had gone on from Saturday evening into Sunday morning. The reception was really just a backyard party at the bride's sister's house. Because no one knew the identities of the wedding crashers, the 2 guys who were acting erratically, the family asked them to leave. Well, these guys didn't like being kicked out of the party. They left and came back with baseball bats. For absolutely no logical reason, they stormed the wedding party with their bats, specifically targeting the groom. Joe was beaten to death while his family gasped and tried desperately to get the men to stop. Sadly, the groom left behind not only his wife, but also his 11-year-old daughter. The police did manage to get the suspects under arrest. They turned out to be brothers with no motive for murder other than being drunk and stupid. Sadly, for Joe's bride, she became a widow before she could even go on her honeymoon. Number 9. The Convict. Stepan Dolgik was arrested in Russia after he got busted beating his wife to death on the day they got married. It wasn't even a question of whether or not he did it. There were multiple terrified wedding guests that witnessed him beating the poor woman. According to the police, Stepan flew into a blind rage at their wedding party because of another guest. He was jealous that the wedding guest was talking to his new wife. But instead of being a reasonable human and talking it out, he took his anger out on the woman, saying that she was behaving incorrectly. And, well, in front of everyone, he beat her until she stopped moving. The day Oksana was married was the same day she died. The police reported that Stepan had a previous conviction for murdering somebody else and had only recently gotten out of prison. Oksana was fully aware of this. She knew he was dangerous. She communicated with him while he did time in prison, but she thought he would be a changed man when he got out. She was sorely mistaken. After Stepan beat her in the house, he dragged her out into the street and kicked her head until his shoe was covered in blood. Then, despite there being ample guests witnessing the murder, he dragged her into a ravine and left her for dead. He was arrested by the police before the end of the day. People at the wedding, although too afraid to do anything that may have saved Oksana's life, did call the cops. It makes you wonder how this guy even got out of jail in the first place. He's clearly wildly unstable. Number 8. Explosive Honeymoon. A pair of newlyweds were warming themselves beside the campfire. They were in a small forest clearing to celebrate their honeymoon. Just a few days before, they had gotten married. It was a huge celebration. Everyone was very happy, and the newlywed couple was set for a long and prosperous marriage. But as they warmed themselves by the fire, something went terribly wrong. One second everything was peaceful, and the next, both the husband and wife were ripped apart by metal shrapnel. Their limbs exploded from their bodies in a horrifying bloodbath. The bloodbath happened because they had built their fire over the top of an abandoned bomb from World War I. The couple had married in Berkshire, England, but because the bride was a native of Ukraine, they went back there to have their honeymoon. As you may already know, Ukraine saw quite a bit of fighting in World War I. In the forests, there are still bombs from the war that have been lost and covered with over 100 years of wild growth. The newlywed couple just so happened to build their fire directly over one of these lost bombs. Lydia lay in the darkness for hours, waiting for medical attention. She had shrapnel wounds to her face and limbs. Her brother, who had been with the couple on their honeymoon hiking in the woods, was dead beside her. When she looked at him, she could see her brother's brain poking through his skull. As for her new husband, Norbert, he miraculously escaped without any serious injuries and was the one who ran for help. It was his wife who took the blunt of the explosion. Number 7. Deadly lightning. In Bangladesh, a lightning strike killed 16 people on their way to a local wedding. There were really no winners in this situation. The group had traveled deep into the rural Chapanawabgaj district for the wedding. They disembarked from their ferry and had to take refuge because a thunderstorm was sweeping in. This was happening about 150 miles from Dhaka. Plus, it was the annual monsoon season, a time of year when lightning kills over 200 people. Normally, these deaths are farmers strolling in the fields, but this time, it was a wedding party on their way to a celebration. Local officials didn't give any information on the exact cause of death. We don't know if it was a single lightning strike that hit the middle of the group, causing everyone to get zapped. We also don't know if the lightning struck a single person, then traveled throughout all 16 individuals. All we know is that when the lightning hit, everyone was dead. Number 6. Dumped in the street. A man in India was in the middle of delivering invitations to his daughter's wedding service when he stumbled upon the unimaginable. Madan Pal Singh was literally holding a stack of wedding invitations in his hand. On his way to give them to the neighbors, he found his daughter's body in the street. She was dead, dumped in the middle of the road. Judging by the horrible condition of her face, it was obvious she had been beaten to death. But just how in the world did this happen? The man's daughter had gone with her fiancé on a shopping trip, but according to the authorities, the shopping trip led to an argument. The argument changed the fiancé's mind about getting married. He wanted out, and because this happened in some tiny village in the middle of India, rather than just breaking up with the girl, the fiancé bludgeoned her to death and dumped her corpse. She was only 19 years old at the time of her murder. The only silver lining here is that the murderous fiancé did get arrested that following day by the police. He's been booked for murder and will hopefully remain behind bars. But in a place where people willingly dump bodies in the street after killing them without even trying to cover it up, who knows how long the murderer will really stay locked up. Number 5. Exboyfriend Blues. It's September of 1999. A bride was shot dead in front of her family in one of the most violent wedding day shootouts ever. The bride was preparing to go to her wedding with her family. The mood was festive. Everyone was having a great time in the bride's New Jersey home. But they were minutes away from heading out for the big day, and out of nowhere, the Grim Reaper strolled into the house. He was the former boyfriend, a guy who had dated Gladys Ricard years ago. He walked past the stretched limousines that were waiting to take the wedding party to church. He walked past the guests, strolled uninvited through the house, and found Gladys. When he did, he opened fire without reservation. This happened coincidentally, just as the bride was posing for her final wedding photograph. The ex-boyfriend, who was dressed appropriately for a wedding in his finest clothes, opened his briefcase, pulled out a gun, and started blasting. According to the New York Times, he was immediately wrestled to the ground by the bride's brother, who held him there until the cops arrived and arrested him. The shooter was identified as Agustin Garcia, who witnesses say could not accept that Gladys had rejected him and moved on with her life. They had broken up about 9 months before she was to be married to the new guy. It was just too soon for Mr. Garcia, whose grief and heartache pushed him to madness. Number 4. Cartel Killers. In Mexico, what was supposed to be the happiest day of one bride's life turned into her final moments on Earth. The bride was assassinated by the Mexican cartel while she was standing at the altar at her own wedding. Not only that, but the cartel also kidnapped the groom. They stormed the wedding, shot the bride, stole the groom, and then drove off in vans. As for why this tragedy happened, it all had to do with rival gangs. According to the National Post, the bride's brother was part of a rival gang in the CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. In a brutal show of force, the cartel ruined the wedding and spilled blood. Even the groom was part of a rival gang. He was an alleged narcotics trafficker named El Calamardo. While this was definitely a tragic incident, it wasn't totally unforeseeable. After all, if you're going to traffic drugs in Mexico and do dealings with cartels, somebody might show up and kill your bride on your wedding day. It's saddest mostly for the family of Karim Ortiz, who was gunned down in front of her loved ones. Number 3. Roaring music. In Afghanistan, a group of gunmen attacked a wedding just because they said the music was being played too loudly. This bizarre shooting unfolded in the Nangarhar province in late October of 2021. The gunmen responsible for the shooting identified themselves as members of the Taliban. According to the BBC, a spokesman for the Taliban even came forward to say that 2 of the 3 gunmen were arrested, though it's yet to be seen if they will actually be punished. To understand why this might have happened, we need to go back in time. You see, music was banned between 1996 and 2001 when the Taliban previously controlled Afghanistan. Now that they are in control again, music at weddings is a big no-no. The Taliban soldiers were so furious to hear loud music blaring out of the wedding that they strolled up and started shooting. 2 people were killed and 10 others were injured. Number 2. Marrying the murderer. A man from Ohio who was convicted of murder got married to the sister of the man whom he was accused of killing. It doesn't get any weirder than this. Crystal Strauss got married to John Tyjan in August of 2021, but over 30 years earlier in 1987, John Tyjan was convicted of killing Crystal's brother, Bryan McGarry. It wasn't just an accusation either. John spent 32 years in prison for the murder, but after 3 decades, the judge finally threw out the murder conviction and granted John a new trial because his defense attorney brought up new photos and police reports. These reports had not been viewed in the original trial. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean that John spent 32 years being innocent. In all honesty, though complete speculation, the new evidence was just a ploy by his defense attorney to get him out of jail. As John was looking at being released, Crystal sent him a letter in which she forgave him. They started talking. One thing led to another, and right before John went on trial the second time, Crystal married him. It really makes you wonder what must have happened in Crystal's life over the past 32 years to make her want to marry her brother's alleged killer. We're still waiting for the retrial to see once and for all if John really is guilty. If he is, it'll be interesting to see if he and Crystal get a divorce. Will she stay married to this guy even when it's proved a second time that he brutally killed her brother? And number 1, girl on fire. A bride set herself on fire while trying to take dramatic wedding photos. It happened in the Fujian province of China, with the photographer being the one who actually set the bride's dress ablaze. His intention was to let the dress burn to create a more artistic photo. And it worked, with the photographer getting great snapshots of the bride with her dress on fire. Of course, since she was wearing a wedding dress, the fire did spread quickly up her gown and to her body. The photographer had to quickly put out the flames with a fire extinguisher, but before she could be severely injured by the fire, it was put out and the photo shoot was over. You might be wondering why anyone would go through all the trouble of ruining a wedding dress just to take dramatic photos like this. Apparently, this is a trend these days. It was started by a guy named John Michael Cooper, a photographer who specializes in weddings. The trend goes back to 2001, with the original purpose being to destroy wedding dresses for the sake of art. 20 years later, it's still a trend, especially in China. And while we don't know of anyone who's been burned alive by their dress just yet, it could definitely happen to anyone, especially if they forget the fire extinguisher. Number 10. Husband Killer. Amber Hilberling is responsible for the savage and heartless murder of Josh Hilberling, who years ago in 2011 she just married to. Josh was found on the street after tumbling 25 floors down from the apartment where he was living with Amber. At the time of his death, Amber was pregnant. At first, the police simply thought it was an accident. It seemed that the man took a bit of a spill out of his window, but before long, they became convinced that Amber was the one who killed her husband on purpose by shoving him to his death. In Amber's defense, she claimed that Josh was abusive and that she pushed him to defend herself. She had to protect herself and her unborn baby from his cruelty. She also added that she didn't mean to kill him and that when she pushed him, he just kind of ended up falling out of the open window. Whatever way you look at it, Amber was a very dangerous woman. The issue was taken to court and Amber was sent to prison for murder for 25 years. Her son, once he was born, went to live with Amber's family. This became an extremely controversial decision by the court because her husband had been abusive. He had gotten addicted to drugs, and he was a danger to Amber and her unborn baby. Whereas some people get less than 10 years for a brutal murder, Amber got life for allegedly defending herself during a violent attack by her spouse. In 2016, Amber died in prison. Number 9. Revenge Gone Wrong. In Michigan in 2020, a woman was arrested for trying to firebomb somebody's SUV. Her name is Sydney Parham, 26 years old at the time of the incident. You may actually recognize this woman because her dangerous assault went viral. She threw an explosive into the SUV, only to have it explode right in her face. She was blown backwards from the explosion. Then she scuttled away, badly hurt. And no surprise, it happened in a Detroit suburb. Sydney was arrested, stuffed in jail, and couldn't pay the $20,000 bond to get out. The police say her motive behind throwing a red gasoline can into the back of an SUV in an attempt to burn it down was that she was angry. She was mad at her boyfriend, presumably for cheating on her, and so she wanted to blow up his car. It might be worth noting that if a woman is so angry at you that she's willing to blow up your car, you might be better off without her anyway. Sydney is obviously extremely dangerous and belongs behind bars. Number 8. Mother and daughter conspirators. A Missouri mother and daughter proved to be two of the most dangerous and most criminally insane women in recent history. The story starts with Diane and Mark Stout, high school sweethearts. The couple bought their first house in Springfield and raised 4 children. Diane was a church organist, and Mark was a guitarist of a local blues band. On the outside, they seemed like perfectly normal people, but Diane eventually went on to become a nurse and make more money than her husband. Her daughter Brianna happened to have a learning disability. Her son had autism. Her other daughter lived at home and had no job. Their final daughter, Rachel, was a star student and the real winner in the family. She played the flute, she was good at math, and she was just all around great. Rachel was Diane's favorite. She didn't care much for her other kids. Then in 2012, Mark Stout suddenly died. His death was ruled as natural causes because he didn't have a very healthy lifestyle. Diana received $20,000 from his life insurance policy and moved the family to a neighborhood and a bigger house. The same year, Sean, the boy with autism, was also found dead. Diane said that he had been sick for several weeks, so it wasn't a big surprise when he died. His death was ruled as natural, and nobody really questioned it. In 2013, the police were given an anonymous tip that there was foul play involved in the 2 deaths. The police began to investigate, and they found that Diane and Rachel had been scheming to kill off the rest of their family members so it can just be the 2 of them. They were planning to take out their family one by one to collect as much insurance money as possible and to live a good life without what they thought of as the losers of the family. Instead, they spent their lives in jail. Number 7. Gail the murderess. Dawn and Gail had been together for 30 years. They had been through a lot together in the 3 decades. On the outside, it seemed like they could never be separated, but behind the veneer and normalcy, there was some real bad stuff going on. The love had evaporated from the relationship, and Gail had started to hate her husband. She hated him so bad that she beat him to death and then cut his body into small pieces. Nobody would have thought back in the 70s that cheerleader Gail Hutchinson would cut apart her boyfriend 30 years later. Chances are, Gail had never thought that would be the ultimate outcome of their relationship either. She got pregnant in high school. They had more kids after high school, and Dawn worked at the local paper mill. But everything changed in 1984 when Gail's mother accidentally lit herself on fire while smoking a cigarette in her trailer. Gail fell apart after that, and not long after, Dawn found a tumor on his spinal cord. The operation left him unable to work, and suddenly the family was plunged into poverty. From here on, it was nothing but trouble. On March 29, 2004, Dawn's head and his limbs were found dumped beside a parkway in Buncombe County. His death was caused by blunt force trauma. When they finally caught up to Gail, she admitted that she beat her husband to death. The cops found her trying to hide in a crawl space beneath the storage shed, wrapped up in a sheet. She had been trying to get a $150,000 insurance policy from her husband's death. But obviously, insurance policies don't really cover murder. She was given 18 years in prison for the crime. Number 6. Femme Fatale Delivery Service. Tiago de Lima was once a crime boss who employed motorcycle women to deliver his drugs across the city of London using trademark pink backpacks. Forget about Tiago, as he was a scummy drug dealer and has been sent to jail for 18 years. It's the Femme Fatale Delivery Service we're here to talk about. Tiago was selling over 90 different drugs, including all the major ones like cocaine and weed, but he was also selling prescriptions. He had an advertisement of 9 pages showing off a shopping list of drugs that people could buy, and when they wanted to buy the drugs, Tiago had his lady motorcycle drivers cruising around from Monday to Saturday, 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., with pink backpacks full of drugs. It's not clear exactly where he managed to hire all these female delivery drivers, but according to police evidence, he also employed a bookkeeper and a manager. His manager, a woman named Vanessa Ananias, took care of all of his distribution centers and organized many of the deliveries. She was sentenced to 6 years in jail. As for the couriers, they were each jailed for 4.5 years. And if you were wondering how much a courier made for delivering drugs through London, it was about $300 a day in US currency. Number 5. Teresa the Torturer. Teresa Jimmy Francine Knorr, or more easily called Teresa the Torturer, was convicted of torturing and murdering 2 of her children and then using her other kids to cover up the crimes. As for right now, she's serving 2 life sentences at the California Institution for Women. Teresa was a typical abuser. She tortured her kids by beating them, burning them with cigarettes, and even throwing knives at them for fun. She did this for years, forcing some of her kids to hold the others down as she beat them and burned them. She even once pointed a pistol at her youngest daughter's head and threatened to murder her. At the end of the day, all 6 of her children suffered at the hands of their mother. Finally, in 1982, Teresa believed that her daughter Susan was casting spells on her, and that was why she was gaining weight. Obviously, the kid denied that she was casting spells, but regardless, Teresa shot her in the back with a .44 caliber handgun. Susan recovered from the bullet wound, but 2 years later, Teresa stabbed her with a pair of scissors and refused to let her go to the hospital for treatment. Instead, she ordered one of her sons to perform the operation himself at only 15 years old, using a knife. The operation led to Susan's death. Shortly after, Teresa also murdered her daughter Sheila. Then in 1993, this terrible woman was finally arrested and charged on 2 counts of murder. Her surviving kids all turned out to be completely insane. Number 4. Robbing a bank, beating her stepfather. In Memphis, Tennessee, a woman had been arrested for robbing a bank and beating up her stepfather. On October 14, 2021, an elderly man phoned the police in Memphis and explained that his stepdaughter had viciously assaulted him. His stepdaughter, Charlo Archie, was a very dangerous and explosive woman. She came into his house uninvited, began to pillage things from his fridge, and then punched him repeatedly in the face when he told her to leave his food and go away. The victim was 72 years old when she beat him up. On her way out, Charlo broke a hole in the wall, smashed a TV, and threatened to kill everyone. Less than 2 weeks later, she was busted robbing the First South Financial Credit Union. She walked in during the lunchtime traffic and demanded that the teller give her money. Police then tracked her down, seeing as she wasn't a very good criminal, and charged her with abuse of a vulnerable adult and aggravated robbery. Number 3. Elderly and disorderly. Just because a woman gets old doesn't mean she stops being dangerous. In the Egyptian city of Nasser, a woman of 70 years old beat her husband to death with a crutch. Her husband was 10 years older, pushing past 80. According to the Egyptian local media, the pair got into an argument because he kept calling her, but she never responded because she had poor hearing. The man then got so angry that he tried to whack her with his cane. She was quick, snatched the cane away from him, and then beat him to death with it. The police received a report from the local hospital that an elderly man had been rushed with evidence of a beating. When the police investigated the body, they found that the husband had been bludgeoned in the head and other parts of his body with a weapon. When questioned, the wife admitted what she did, although she did say that it wasn't her intention to kill him. It just kind of happened. The wife has since been arrested, though considering her age, it's unclear what exactly the authorities will do with her. Number 2. Judy Moren. Judy Moren was the matriarch behind the infamous Moren crime family of Australia. The family has ties going all the way back to Ireland, before Australia was ever even its own country. At least, that's what they say. The family dealt in all the usual mafia crime: extortion, drug trafficking, and murder. Judy was at the head of all of it. Her first husband was shot dead in a drug-related conflict with another gang in 1982. Her son Mark was murdered in 2000, while her other son was murdered in 2003. The man she was in a relationship with after her first husband, Louis, was then killed in 2004. Basically, everyone in her family except her ended up dead from gang violence. She really was at the top of the pyramid. But in 2011, Judy was sentenced to spend 26 years in jail for the murder of Des Moren, the brother of Louis, who she'd gotten separated from in 1995 and was killed in 2004. Des was shot in the head in a Melbourne cafe in 2009. Even though she didn't physically pull the trigger, she did pay an assassin to kill the man, and for that, she was guilty of murder. And number 1, getting the kids to help. A woman from Laporte shot and killed her husband, then used an axe to partially cut his body up. Not only that, but this dangerous psychopathic woman then got her 2 teenage kids involved in a botched attempt to ditch the body. The killer's name is Thessalonica Allen, and she was charged in July of 2021 with the death of her husband, Randy Allen. She was also charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, the abuse of a corpse, and neglect of a dependent. After Thessalonica killed her husband, she had his body stuffed in a closet inside a tote. She had needed to cut his legs off with an axe to fit him into the tote. Then she had her young kids help get the tote with his body into her vehicle. Unfortunately for her, the body was too heavy, even for her and the two kids. They couldn't get it in the car. After this failed attempt, she tried to get one of her friends to help ditch the body, but the friend went to the police instead of helping cover up a murder. Thessalonica was swiftly apprehended. When asked by the authorities why she shot her husband, she claimed that it happened after a physical altercation. She said she only did it to defend herself, but the moment that she started chopping his body with an axe, well, all her credibility really went out the door.
Would you rather be in a toxic relationship with intense physical chemistry or an emotionally stable relationship that lacks the mind-blowing attraction that most people look for in a partner? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.